Okay, we're in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 23. Okay, let's begin with a short prayer. Father, we ask your blessing and guidance on the election today. We ask your protection for the demonstration that's going to take place in Washington, D.C. We ask that you could bring a source of peace within our society. We ask this in the name of Jesus the Lord. Okay, this is 8:23, and depending on how your Bible shows it, it's really the beginning of a whole new section. We don't know why the verses are broken there. That should really be 9:1. It should begin there. But anyway, it says, "For there is no darkness for her who was oppressed." And what he's talking about is the deliverance of Israel after the punishments came on for the things they were doing. We talked a lot about that last time. But in this deliverance of Israel, the deliverance is so complete that Israel is not going to remember what was going on, that sort of thing. The idea it'll disappear. As in the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, so in the future he will glorify the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, the territory of the nations. And so what he's talking about is these places had been oppressed. Now they're freed and they're glorified. But notice the extension that he says the way of the sea is called the Via Mare, and the Via Mare goes clear around the Mediterranean. It's one of the most ancient roads in the world, but it goes around the Mediterranean. And this Via Mare then is largely pagan, even where what we would call Israel today. When the Via Mare goes through Israel, it goes through right on the coast. Remember, the Jews weren't on the coast. They were in the Jordan Valley. So it's all pagan. And what he's saying here is that he will free Israel from their problems, then he will glorify Israel, and once Israel's glorified, he's going to glorify everyone. So it moves off. And you see some very specific examples of this in later prophecies, that the first place he's going to glorify after Israel, actually Egypt, and that it would go to Egypt and then sort of move out that way. And when you think about it, the Egyptians would be viewed as the oppressors of Israel because of the slavery thing, but that's not the issue. The issue is that God's going to glorify everything, and he will do it, this process that goes on. At the time of Jesus, one of the difficulties is the readers of the prophecies had no longer were aware of how the prophecies affected the Gentiles and how they meant, like, for instance, if you watch Jesus himself, last Sunday might have been, I can't remember now, but in the last few days anyway, there's the story of Jesus curing the centurion's son. Was that last Sunday? I can't remember. But anyway, if you notice in the thing, the centurion sends the person to Jesus because I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. And when it gets all finished, Jesus says, I have not found such faith in Israel. See, Jesus you have to remember that Jesus as a human being had the education, everything that you would have in the Jews. The Jews at that time basically believed the Messiah was sent to the Jews, okay? But what the prophecies say is the Messiah will rise from the Jews. It isn't that the Messiah is just for the Jews, but will rise from the Jewish community. But in Jesus is shocked that Jews don't have faith, and he's shocked when he finds a Gentile who does, because the basic background is non-Jews don't have faith and Jews do. It's kind of like defining people by their denomination. It doesn't really work. So anyway, he goes on. He says, the people that have walked in darkness have seen a great light. On the inhabitants of a country in a shadow dark as death, light has blazed forth. You may remember that this is the first reading for the Feast of the Epiphany. And it's this idea that what is the people who've walked in darkness? He's not talking about the Jews now. We've moved on from that. The Jews are people who walked in the light, whether they followed it or not, but they walked in the light. But the Gentiles walked in darkness. So he says the people who walk in darkness have seen the great light, and they see the light that comes from the Messiah to Israel. And this light has blazed forth. You have enlarged the nations. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at harvest time, as they exult when they're dividing plunder. So he says that this idea of this reign of the Messiah is to bring joy, obviously to Israel, but that's the earlier part of the thing before we started today. But it's also to bring joy to the whole world, and ultimately everyone will rejoice in it. And as he said, that people who have walked in darkness now see this sort of blazing light. And the idea is here that we will, as a people, move away from the distinctions that we knew as a people before the Messiah. And that's why, like, if you watch really an understanding, the understanding that's rising today, for instance, of denominations. That one of the I think I would just in the Galapagos, but the one of the things you study there is the interrelationship of the animals and things. And if something is introduced that is not right, then they rid it. They rid the islands of it. They closed one of them, San Cristobal, for several years to kill all the goats on the island, because the goats were eating what the tortoises are supposed to eat. But in using this about the interrelationships of things, that one of the rising ideas, and it begins with Teilhard de Chardin, is that as a Catholic, I am a better Catholic if there are Muslims in the community, and will be a better Catholic as a result of there being Muslims in the community rather than converting them. And the Muslims will be better Muslims as a result of Catholics being in the community. And that's true of all religions. And if you accept that as a norm, it's a very interesting thing to go back and look at history. Like you could look at the rise of Christianity if you're a Jew. The rise of Christianity could be a way of reforming Judaism. Not that all Jews were to become Christians, that isn't the issue. But the Jews who stay Jews are to be better Jews as a result of that. And the Jewish tradition should make us better Catholics. And that you watched the big thing that was rising when Muhammad began, the big thing that was rising was idolatry in the Catholic Church, where statues were worshipped as people and stuff like that. I think the whole thing of the Muslim deal is there is only one God. In fact, they're suspicious of the Trinity, but there is only one God. And so God could well have raised up the Muslims to reform our thing like this. And you certainly see it with regards to the Protestant tradition. Like when scriptures began to sort of fade away in the light of Mary becoming more and more important, up comes Luther, salvation, Bible alone, And you watch this, but if you watch it historically, it's a very interesting thing that I think a wise person will study these different religions, not with any idea of changing or anything like that, but to realize what it teaches you. And one of the things that was most interesting to me when I was studying at Berkeley, it was the rise during the 60s of the end of the 60s. The whole business of Hinduism was very, very prominent. And because I'd studied it a lot, I taught it for a while at Berkeley. But the thing that was fascinating to me was so many Catholics would come in to a study on Hinduism, and come to understand the whole business of meditation that was a part of the Catholic tradition right from the beginning. The meditation and that sort of thing is a huge thing in the Catholic tradition. But for some reason, it wasn't emphasized. Like I would say, when I was a youngster in school, the main thing that was emphasized was moral conduct. It was emphasized over faith. It was emphasized over devotions. Everything was strong moral conduct. That was the whole thing. And that's part of religion. But what leads to strong moral conduct is strong faith, that lead meditation. All these things are, and I think these different things bring us up to understand this. And what he's talking about is all of this is going to work together for the benefit of the Jews too. Like he raises the Jews up, but he does not harm the Jews by raising up the Gentiles. Or does he harm either one of us by raising up the pagans? This whole thing of this raising up. I think that one of the sad things in a society, let's say like California, and I think you know that one of the things going on in the election today is that California is the state where you have the widest break between the poor and the rich. The rich in California are not rich, they're mega rich. And the poor in California are not poor, they're destitute. There's this massive thing. And I always remember one of the things that Lincoln wrote. Lincoln said, you cannot benefit the poor by destroying the rich. You cannot benefit the uneducated by destroying the educated. You can't. He goes through this thing that the whole idea is that we as a society can benefit the poor and raise the poor without destroying the rich. We can raise the education thing. And the problem is that if you're among the well-to-do, as we in general are, you almost begin to think that if somehow they rise, it's going to be less for me. But that isn't true, because to the degree that they're way down, we're threatened. People are always threatened by that. And you destroy the threat by raising the thing up, you know? So, but to understand the benefit of others is always to the benefit of me, always. The benefit of other people will always be to the benefit of me. He said, for the yoke that weighed upon them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressors, these you have broken, as on the day of Midian. The day of Midian was a battle that destroyed an army that was actually coming to destroy Jerusalem, and an army they didn't think they could really defeat. And this war at Midian was an anointed war by God. You know, God really directed it, everything. But the enemies were destroyed at that time. So he says, the yoke that weighed upon them. And we're going to find out as we go on in the text that the yoke that weighs upon people is in fact death and the fear of death. Okay? Now, understand that they had very little understanding of everlasting life at this time. In fact, the Jews were famous for building large monuments with their names on it. I think you know that that's a big deal today with Jews. If you go on PBS or something, there's all these Jewish names connected with foundations that are supporting these things. And that for them, that's at times, that's their concept of everlasting life. The people remember you benevolently and this sort of thing and tell stories about you. But that was true at that time. But this idea that the whole burden of human life, the difficulty of human life, is in fact not death, but the fear of death. Because like death is present, whether people like it or not. Death is there. The fear of death doesn't have to be. And the fear of death, you know, different cultures, I think if you look in most religious cultures, we deal with talking about a spiritual life after death and everything, so that's part of it. But you know, in the Native American culture, I think it's dealt with as being the necessary part of life. If you're going to live, you're going to die. That's, that's what it is. It's a sequence thing. And so one of the things in Native Americans is that you make sure children are at the bedside of people dying so that they integrate that into their life and realize people die. That's just the thing. And then it doesn't prevent your dying, but it prevents the fear of death. And in many ways, Thomas Aquinas deals with this. He says that the bulk of problems in society are the fear of death. He says nations go to war because they fear someone else is going to kill them. And there's death in the form of stealing, where you undermine a person's authority. There's death in destroying someone's reputation. They're all forms of death. And the idea is that they can all happen, but the danger to them is the fear. I remember Winston Churchill, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Fear is the dangerous thing. I saw a great program the other day with regards to the war and the termination of the war. And they said the real problem with the war was that the nation, and particularly the president, was so shocked by 9/11. They were terrified in the country that we were so vulnerable. And so they made these decisions out of fear. So they went into Afghanistan, then they decided they'd go into Iraq, and they decided to, and all these things were fear. And sometimes there were fears of things that weren't even there, like the mass destruction stuff that Saddam Hussein was supposed to have that didn't exist. But the fear, we always make bad decisions in fear. Fear fosters bad decisions. And in most of us, the main fear is the fear of death. Okay? He says, for all the footgear clanking over the ground and all the clothing rolled in blood will be burned, will be food for the flames. And why does he talk about these particular things? Is because these things are oftentimes used to commemorate wars. You very often find soldiers commemorated by boots. And they do that oftentimes in the military. When someone dies or the body's not there, they use the boots. So the boots are a symbol of that. And the other thing is the clothing rolled in blood. That I've been to museums where they have shirts from the Civil War with the blood on them. In fact, I don't know how many of you know this. You know the flag of Austria is a red, white, and red. The flag of Austria is a shirt. And during one of the great battles in which the enemies that were trying to take over Vienna were defeated, the general who led it, at the end of it, he was wearing this shirt, and he was killed, and he bled to death. And when they took the shirt off him, he had a heavy belt around the middle, holding the shirt on, and that's their flag, the red, the white, the red. It's a commemoration of the thing. So he says these things ultimately, he says, they go into the flames. And why? Because commemorations of war are commemorations of death. Okay, so they all go in. He says, for a son has been born for us. A son has been given to us, and dominion has been laid upon his shoulders. Okay? It's a messianic prophecy that ultimately there's one given to us, and he's a son. Okay? Reading this as a Jew at that time, you would immediately think of a king, because the son of a king is designated. It would never occur to them at the time, we're talking Son of God, okay? But the Son, and the Son has been given to us. Notice, the Son is for us and to us. It means that we're to care for the Son, that we take care of the Son, but ultimately the Son is for our benefit. And you think of it like with regards to parents who take care of a child and then have children take care of them when they get older. That sort of thing. But the child is given, and the child ultimately is for the benefit of the parents, although the parents have to be for the benefit of the child as it goes along. This particular prophecy is what is the horror of Jesus being crucified because of the accusations of the Jewish high priests, who could have saved him and didn't, that he came to his own did not receive him, this sort of thing. So dominion has been laid on his shoulders, and this is the name he has been given, okay? This is whenever I read this verse, I always think of Handel's Messiah. But it says the name he has been given is Wonder Counselor. And it's I think, good to look at these individual things. The Wonder Counselor, I don't know how often you're involved in decision-making gatherings of people where you get together, you have to make a decision of some kind. And periodically, you have all this go through, and someone says something that once they say it is so obvious, you don't know why someone else didn't think of it in the first place. In fact, you don't know why you're even having the meeting, with the solution being so simple. But they just voice it. That's Wonder Counselor. The Wonder Counselor is the one who sees the obvious, easy, simple solution that baffles everyone, okay? So he ultimately is the Wonder Counselor. The next, he is the Mighty God. Now remember, the Jews always connect, or everyone in the world at that time, connected the God with the people. So if we're an enslaved people, we have a pretty weak God. If I'm enslaving you, I have a pretty strong God, okay? So ours, we have to always remember that whatever the situation is, our God is mighty. He is a mighty God above all things. And I think you realize, again, following the counselor thing, that things go on in our lives that we like, and things go on in our lives that we don't like. And we could, see that any way we want. But time reveals that a lot of things we don't like in our lives are very good for us. A lot of things we do like in our lives are not good for us. And that's the whole thing of the Wonder Counselor, that our God knows how to work it all out, and he is mighty enough to do it. The thing is, we begin to think he is weak when he doesn't do what we think should be done in the thing, but he isn't. He's always this mighty God. The next thing, he's eternal Father, and I'd like to do this. It would probably be better said to be eternally fatherly. It's just that he remains the Father. We had a play at, what do you call it, the parish at Spreckles at one point. And I think it was a play about certain good foods that we were supposed to be eating. I don't remember. I used this last Sunday in one of the masses at a nativity. But there was this little girl, and her job was to play a tomato. Now, tomatoes don't do a lot. They just stand there. That's all she had to do. She had this bulbous tomato costume, and this little thing on her head that was the stem for the tomato. Anyway, she's up there. She slips. I mean, all she had to do was stand there, for God's sake. And so she slipped. Fortunately, we didn't end up with ketchup. We just, stood the girl up and went on. But it was interesting talking to her mother afterwards, that we were sort of visiting, and her mother was absolutely convinced there must have been something on the stage that caused her to slip, that she wouldn't slip, this sort of thing. In fact, as the mother described her performance, and her performance, remember, is standing there, that's it. So, but as the mother described the performance, you would have thought the girl had just danced Swan Lake, that it was, Academy Award material, all this sort of thing. But what you're listening to is the parent speaking. And that's what he's trying to tell us, that in relationship to God, he is always my parent. So people could say, we come before God for judgment at the end of our lives. We do indeed. But he doesn't stand over me as a judge. He stands over me as a parent. And he cannot give up being parent. Just, like if you are a parent of a child And there's things that you cannot give up the role of parent. I oftentimes think of the Queen of England. The Queen of England is, the titular head of state over, let's say, Andrew. But Andrew does not deal with her as head of state or titular head of state or anything. He deals with her as mother. That's the parent thing. And remember that our God is always the parent. So whatever role he has that role as parent with regards to us. And the next thing is Prince of Peace. And the idea of Prince of Peace is this concept of being able to rule without violence. So that God has a way of ruling without violence to the way his plan is followed. And we've seen a few societies in history that have sort of been faithful to this sort of thing. A place that I think is kind of faithful to this is the Philippines. In the Philippines, there's great disparity between the rich and the poor, but the rich take care of the poor, and consciously. And when you're over there, you don't find sad poor people. People seem to generally to be very, very happy. And like, for instance, when the vaccines come out, the vaccines are very expensive. There are lots of places you can't get them in the Philippines. But where you can get them, if a poor person comes up, they get the vaccine. If a rich person comes up, they pay for the vaccine. They just run things, but they have a society where this authority over it is the authority, but the authority tries to rule in peace, and it seems to work very good. As you know, that's very different than if we talk about the government in the Philippines, which in fact I know nothing about, but I'm talking about the way it functions in the society. Okay, I've reached the point in my life where I'm ultimately suspicious of all government. His rule will be great, and there will be no end of peace for the throne of David and for his kingdom. Okay? Notice they re-emphasize the thing of peace. And his kingdom will be great, his rule will be great, and there'll be no end. This kingdom will go on. Serene and established in fair judgment and righteousness, from this time onwards and forever, the jealous love of Yahweh Sabaoth will do this. So he says it's God's jealous love for his people that actually causes him to bless everyone. Okay? And I guess an example of this would be if you study the great age of the financial barons in the United States, like Carnegie, Ford, all these people, they formed their own community, and that they were the ones who were at parties together and stuff like this. And it was very uncomfortable for them to have people who didn't have that kind of money around them. I remember visiting the house of Post. What was her name? I can't think. She's the heiress to the Post cereals. And
Lee Merriweather Post?
yes. What was the first name again?
Lee Merriweather Post.
Yes. But anyway, she used to have parties at her house, and they have the outfits that she wore to the parties, a lot of them there. You would think, the way a person would prepare for a party, but not at the level that she was at. At the level she was at, she would call Fabergé or Tiffany and send them a swatch of material for the gown she was wearing. And so she'd have an emerald like this that would match the green of and just unbelievable stuff. But you're looking at an outfit right now that probably is the equivalent of $1 million at that time, though. And the thing is, you can't very well put that on and have someone come in with a nice dress from Sears. It just doesn't work. And so it is to the benefit of, let's say, the Post family. It's to their benefit that everyone's rich, then everyone can come to their parties, and no one's feels bad or anything. And so that's one of the reasons. He says he is going to do this because he's jealous for his own people Israel. And for them to have the blessings and to truly enjoy the blessings, everyone has to have the blessings. And so that's kind of how he goes about it. And now we turn back to the punishment of Israel. I've told you at the beginning that the Isaiah prophecies are not done in historical sequence, and oftentimes you cannot determine the historical sequence. But the reigns of kings that they mention in it, I think it covers about 220 years. So the prophecies of Isaiah came from Isaiah, and then they would reapply his teachings over a different time to different situations. And all this then came together in the book of Isaiah. So it doesn't follow a set thing. He says, the word of the Lord has sent out a word to Jacob, and it has fallen on Israel, and the whole people will know it. Okay? So God speaks a word. The word is given to Israel, and the entire people will know it. Remember, at this time, Israel and Judah are two separate areas. Israel is the north, and Judah is the area where Jerusalem is the south. And probably close to the division, if you just think of it in your mind, is the Sea of Galilee. The lower part of the Sea of Galilee is Samaria, and then you go into Judah, down towards Jerusalem. So the message now comes to Israel, okay? And but the whole people are going to know it. He says, Ephraim and the inhabitants of Samaria, who say in the pride of their arrogant hearts, the bricks have fallen, but we shall rebuild with dressed stone. Sycamores have fallen, we shall replace them with cedars. And the idea is, remember the oppression of Israel. First of all, God, broke the enemy's power over Israel. Samaria was one of those areas that had power over Israel. And Ephraim, which actually is one of the areas of Israel, allied itself with Samaria and to go down there. And so the idea is now these places have gone through their disaster. But unlike Israel, who at the time of their disaster, realized what occurred was God's punishment. And so Israel realized it was a punishment and then went about the reform and this sort of thing. But they say no. They say, so the bricks have fallen down, so we'll use stone. We'll build stone. And the sycamores have fallen, so we shall replace them with cedars. Cedars were very, very important at that time because the cedars, I think grow very, very straight. So obviously it's a good way to get wood for building, but even better, they were the things they could use for the masts in ships. So cedars were extremely, extremely valuable as a tree. So he says, but the Lord has raised their foe against them. He has whipped up their enemies. Aram to the east, that's Arabia. Philistines to the west. Remember I told you the Philistines are along the coast? That's the pagans in that area, which is why the area was called Palestine. It says, to devour Israel with gaping jaws. After all of this, his anger is not spent, his arm still outstretched. So remember, Israel's being punished. These nations around are being punished too, in order to, ultimately free Israel. That we read in another book of prophecy that God set these nations up to punish Israel, but rather than punishing Israel, they were about destroying Israel. So God decided they had to be destroyed. And so that's what's going on here. But it begins with Israel. He says, but the people would not come back to him who struck them. They would not seek out the Lord Sabaoth. So now these pagan lands who are going through the problems think, well, we'll rebuild and all this sort of thing. But Israel did not return to God initially. It's sort of like a vicious circle that they sort of evolve away from God, and then when the punishments come, they see it as an excuse to evolve further away from a God that isn't doing them good. And it works this way oftentimes in the history of Israel. He says, hence the Lord has topped and tailed Israel. I have never seen that word translated tailed before. But what he's done is cut off the top and the bottom of Israel, okay? Because remember, below is Egypt, and Egypt now is eroding into Israel, and above is Samaria, and Samaria is eroding into Israel. He says, cutting off palm and reed in a single day, okay? And the palm and the reed are plants that grow in Israel, but even more, they're plants from Egypt. Egypt, I think as the date palms, and Egypt also has the reeds they used to make papyrus. That was one of the great wealths of Egypt. He says the top is the cedar, and the people of rank. The tail is the prophet, teaching lies. So, and incidentally, this is, I don't know if you have it in yours, is in parentheses, because some manuscripts it doesn't exist in. That's why it's there. And they would take out the parentheses if they're absolutely sure of it. But whoever wrote this interprets the top as the leaders and interprets the tail as the prophets. And the people of rank are misleading the people, and the prophets are teaching lies. He says, this people's leaders have led them astray, and those who are led by them are swallowed up. We would know this in our structure. This is basically called malpractice. But if a person does something, and depending on the position you have in society, the same thing can be more and more serious. Like, for instance, one of these, there was a thing on the news today that people are taking some kind of a drug that is for horses as a way of fighting the pandemic. Now, for me to tell you, I think it's a good idea to take whatever the thing is wrong. For a doctor to tell you that is catastrophic. It's a very serious thing. We see this with regards to crimes, too. For someone to shoot me, it isn't the same thing as shooting the president, not by any means. And so people make these things more serious. So when the prophet is the one lying, then who's seen as the liar? It's God. If the prophet's administering God's word and everyone sees it's a lie, like the prophecy says something will happen, it doesn't, it's God who's the liar. The lie rests on God. And so this is why it's so serious. And that's why the society is being corrupted here. Hence the Lord will no longer take delight in their young people, nor pity their orphans and widows, since all of them are godless and evil, and everything they say is madness. So he says, since this is going on, God sort of moves away. God is supposed to be the protector of the orphans, the widows, and this sort of thing. And God just steps back and let them realize the effects of what they're doing. It's like in the United States today, it's almost mind-boggling that people will avoid the vaccinations knowing the consequences. And the statistics and everything are there. And it's just mind-boggling. But that's what's going on here in Israel, that the punishments are coming from God. They know they're punishments because they're working against God in what they're doing, but it doesn't change the way they're doing it. And so they go on. It says, after all this, his anger is not spent. His arm is still outstretched. Like, how could the punishments end if the problems don't? Okay, so the punishments are still there. And he goes on, he said, wickedness burns like a fire, devouring the bramble, the thorn bush, setting the forest thickets ablaze, and they all go up in billowing smoke. And Israel is very much like us. The climate is almost exactly the same. That's why so many plants we have here, figs and grapes and stuff, are all plants from the Holy Land. But California is an excellent example right now of what happens when a fire starts in an area like that. We have the grass that causes a fire to move very fast. I don't know if I've ever told you, but as youngsters on the Native American reservation in Canada, which is on the prairies, we were always warned about prairie fires. I've been in 3 of them now. But one of the things they warned you as children is when a prairie fire is coming, you run into the fire. The reason you run into the fire, it moves very fast. And if you're running from the fire, it will outrun you. But if you go through, you're in all burned area immediately. Like the fire is just like a little wall. And once you're through it, it's over. It's just terrifying to run into it. But that's what you do. But the fire on the grass stuff goes very fast and then ignites the trees and stuff as it goes on, and this whole thing. He says, this is the way wickedness spreads. And I think something to understand here is that wickedness spreads by wickedness. But goodness spreads by goodness. And they both work that way. And if you're driving down the highway and someone makes a specific effort to help you get into where you want to go and everything, you'll do it for someone next. And if someone cuts you off, you're probably going to cut someone off the next. These things grow in society. And what we're called on as believers is to make sure we are never part of the growth of evil, but always the part of the growth of good. So I should be the driver who, when I'm cut off, will still let someone else in as I see they're trying to get in, which is why I don't drive. But the idea is, as a believer, I should be the one who, whenever I'm in that situation, I lean to the good, because it spreads that way. Both of them do. He says, the country has been set on fire by the fury of the Lord Sabaoth, and the people are like food for the flames. And so he says this wickedness spreads, and the people are like the food for the flames, which is the tinder and stuff. The people just take up the wickedness and carry it on. Everyone's part of the wickedness. No one spares a thought for a brother or a sister. They have sliced to the right and are still hungry. They have eaten to the left and are still not satisfied. Each devours the flesh of their own arm. He says that ultimately the society is destroying itself. I don't know if I've ever told you that the Catholic Church is the only religion that I know of any religion, that has a theology of tyrannicide. And the theology of tyrannicide is the theology of how you can kill a tyrant. And this was the theology that Pius XII used with regards to Volcari, incidentally. But one of the keys in the theology of tyrannicide, you may not execute or kill a tyrant unless you have a full-fledged government to replace him. Because any society is worse off with no government than they are with a bad government. Okay? no government, a society begins to consume itself, begins to tear itself apart. And so this idea of this is what's happening in Israel. He says Manasseh devours Ephraim, Ephraim Manasseh. Together they turn against Judah. After all this, his anger is not spent. His arm is still outstretched. So God watches as this punishment that comes on causes them to visit it on one another and the community. And remember, Ephraim and Manasseh are both tribes of Israel, okay? And they're at war with one another. He says, woe to those who enact unjust decrees, who draft oppressive statutes. Okay? So now he's pointing out that one of the very serious problems here is the leaders in Israel. The leaders, the prophets, remember, are speaking lies. And what are the lies? They're saying the government's wonderful, everything's fine, we're doing well. So the prophets are speaking lies. But the government is governing to its own benefit. They're trying to keep everything to themselves. And to do this, they give unjust decrees, and they do this oppressive statutes, mainly in forms of taxes. And it says they go on, they deny justice to the weak. Why do they deny justice to the weak? Because the strong can afford to buy justice, okay? To cheat of fair judgment the humble of the people. To make widows their prey and rob the orphan. Remember, the widow and the orphan cannot go to court. And so they rob them. He says, what will you do on the day of judgment? Okay? And I think this is the statement where he talks about it's hard enough to live in a society of wrong and difficulty and this sort of thing. But to always keep in mind, there is a day of judgment that comes. And when we think of judgment, we oftentimes think in terms of punishing the wicked and this sort of thing. But when I think of judgment, I think of my standing before God. I don't look at how, people who I think have hurt me or been unjust to me or punished. That's not an issue to me. My issue is that when I stand before God, I will be judged. And how much have I participated in this evil? How much have I contributed to it? That's the issue. Now, someone else may be really responsible for setting it up, but that's not the issue I have to deal with. When I come before God, I have to deal with how I contributed to it. I'm not a prophet who tells people that God says such and lies to them. I don't do that. I'm not a person who enacts evil statutes and this sort of thing. But am I the person through whom those evil statutes are allowed to work? Am I the one who cooperates with a bad government? Am I the one who repeats what the rotten prophet has said because it appeals and supports the government? That's what we need to know. What will I do on the day of judgment when disaster comes from far away? To whom will you run for help? Okay? So what do you do on that day? Where do you find help if you have been the one who denied help to all these others? Where will you turn for help? Remember that, I don't know who wrote it. I've seen an example of it, I think in Samuel Clemens. But the idea that, they come to take away the Jews and I did nothing. They come to take away the Muslims, I did nothing. Pardon?
Nehemiah, not Rabbi, a German Protestant Nehemiah in Berlin. He said when they came to arrest the communists, I did nothing. When they came to arrest the Jews, I did nothing. When they came to arrest me, no one stood.
No one came, yeah. But it's just that idea that if you work against, you don't participate in this. Remember, he's not talking about doing evil here. He is just not helping, okay? He says, Where will you leave your riches to avoid squatting among the captives, or failing among the slain? The thing is that falling among the slain. The thing is that when think in terms of the French Revolution, when the revolution came in, they attacked the rich. That's where the money was. If you're one of the poor people, you aren't going to be attacked, okay? And so the rich were the captives, and the rich were killed, and this sort of thing. And so you're accumulating the wealth. The injustice will cause you to be judged by God, and the disparity will cause you to be punished by the people. And so it all works together. He says, after all this, his anger is still not spent, his arm still outstretched. So even at this point, the disaster must continue. Okay? So we'll stop here and start on chapter 10 next time, hoping it gets happier. Does anyone have any questions?